In this video, we're going to talk about income inequality and how we can use a Lorenz curve to represent that. This table captures the distribution of incomes in the U.S. in 1970 and again in 2019. Households are sorted from the lowest to the highest income, and they're broken up into quintiles, which represent 20% of the income distribution. Those households whose income fell on the bottom 20% of the income distribution in 1970 received 4.1% of the total income in society. Those households whose income fell between the 20th and the 40th percentile, the second quintile, received 10.8% of total income. Those households who fell in the middle of the distribution, in the third quintile, between the 40th and the 60th percentile, received 17.4% of the total income. Households whose income fell between the 60th and the 80th percentile, or the fourth quintile, received 24.5% of total income. And households whose incomes were in the top 20% of society received 43.3% of total income. So the rightmost column in this table represents the same values for 2019. And what we can note is that income inequality seems to have increased because in 1970, households whose income fell in the bottom 20% of the income distribution received 4.1% of the total income. By 2019, that had fallen to 3.1%. Similarly, in the second, third, and fourth quintiles, the proportion of income received by households in those categories fell between 1970 and 2019. But we observed that incomes in the top quintile rose fairly substantially. What that suggests is that individuals with high incomes did substantially better in 2019, while all other groups received a smaller share of total income. Now, this is not measuring the level of incomes, it's measuring the distribution of income and the degree of inequality in income distribution. This table comes from the United States Census Bureau Table H2, and you can just do a quick web search for that, and you'll be able to find current data on that. This data was current as of the time this was recorded in late November 2020, in the midst of a global pandemic. This data, though, can be used to construct what we call a Lorenz curve. What this Lorenz curve represents is using this data and using the same sorting of households from the lowest to the highest income. It's a relationship between the cumulative proportion of households and the cumulative proportion of income. So instead of looking at incomes within each quintile, we're going to look at how much income is received by people in the bottom 20%, and the bottom 40%, and the bottom 60%, 80%, and 100% of the population. Those numbers have now been added here. This is the basic data that underlies the Lorenz curve we'll be talking about very shortly. But let's look at how we can go from the table on the right to this data. We know that at 0% of the income distribution, there's no one in that category and there's no income received. That's how we get the first row. The 20th percentile would correspond to the income received by the lowest quintile, and you notice those values are just the same as those in the table on the right. But when we look at the 40th percentile for the population, we're looking at the total proportion of the income received by households in the bottom 40%, which would consist of the total share of income received by households in the bottom two quintiles. So in 1970, that would be 4.1 plus 10.8, or 14.9. In 2019, the proportion of income received by the bottom 40% of the population would be the percent received by the bottom 20%, plus the percent received by the next 20%, or the second quintile, which would be 3.1 plus 8.3, or a total of 11.4. To get the values for the third quintile, we just add up the shares received in the first, second, and third quintiles, which add up to 32.3 and 25.5. To get to the 80th percentile, that would consist of people in the first, second, third, or fourth quintiles. So we add up those values in each of the columns, and we get 56.8 and 48.2. When we get to the 100th percentile, that now includes everybody. And when we look at the income received by the bottom 100% of households, that would obviously consist of 100% of total income. So that's the basic data. What we're going to do now is take that data and use it to construct a Lorenz curve. The Lorenz curve just plots out these points. What's represented here now is the Lorenz curve for 1970. And we know that at the 0 percentile, 0 income is received. So that would be that first red dot on this diagram. When we get to the 20th percentile, households receive in 1970 4.1% of the income, which is represented by the second red dot on this Lorenz curve. At the 40th percentile, we have 14.9% of income received, and so forth as we move along the curve. So this blue curve represents the 1970 Lorenz curve for the U.S. economy, and it tells us what the distribution of income looks like across households in 1970. One other thing we should note is that the 45-degree line in this diagram represents a line of perfect income equality, because if all households had equal income, it wouldn't matter how we sorted them, and any 20% of the population would get 20% of the income. The bottom 40% would get 40% of the income, and it would just simply be that 45-degree line. And so the further we are away from that line of income equality, the greater the extent of income inequality. Now, let's do the same thing for 2019. I've added the 2019 Lorenz curve to this diagram. And what you can see is we're further from the line of income equality, and we end up with a significantly more unequal distribution of income. And that's the way in which Lorenz curves are typically used, to observe how income inequality changes over time within the economy or across the economies. Now, we should probably at least briefly address some of the reasons for the growth in income inequality that we've been observing in the U.S. since roughly the 1980s. One reason for the growth in inequality is a growth in the skill premium. In general, people with college degrees or skilled workers have been doing relatively better. The demand for skilled workers has been increasing faster than the supply. On the other side of this, though, the market for less skilled workers has been relatively poor. Part of this growth in the skill premium is because skilled workers are getting paid more. Part of it is that high school graduates and high school dropouts are getting paid significantly less. One of the reasons for this is technological change. Technological change in recent decades has tended to favor labor of more skilled workers. Roughly speaking, less skilled workers are easier to replace with machines and automated production processes than are skilled workers. International trade has also played a role in that many manufacturing tasks have been outsourced to other countries. Another factor, though, has to do with demographic shifts. And one thing that has changed is that we have significantly more single-parent households today than we did in the 1970s and 1980s. Single-parent households tend to have relatively low incomes compared to two-parent households. Another factor at the other side of this, though, is that in general we see there's a fair amount of positive assortative mating. And what that means is that people tend to marry people with similar characteristics. Specifically here, it's referring to education and earnings potential. Partly that's just because people often meet when they're completing their schooling, and they end up often marrying people who they spend more time with. So what we observe is that college graduates tend to marry other college graduates, high school graduates tend to marry other high school graduates. What this means basically is that the correlation of each of the partners in a relationship tends to result in a growth in income inequality, because high-income people marry other high-income people, which when they're both working, leads to a much larger increase in earnings, while low-income individuals tend to marry low-income individuals, which tends to result in substantially lower income. So the combination of positive assortative mating and the growth in two-earner households over the last 50 or 60 years are two factors that have also contributed to the growth in income inequality. Another factor is, beginning with the Reagan administration and continuing with the George W. Bush administration and then the Trump administration, the tax structure has become substantially less progressive. The degree of progressivity of a tax structure is the extent to which the tax structure is used to redistribute income. Essentially, a progressive tax structure taxes higher income individuals at a higher rate than low income individuals. And the degree of progressivity of the tax structure declined with the tax cuts during the Reagan, George W. Bush, and Trump administrations, because in each case, taxes were disproportionately lowered for those individuals with higher incomes. That tends to lead to an increase in income inequality. One other thing we should note is that the Lorenz curve can also be used to measure the degree of inequality in wealth distribution. And wealth inequality is substantially larger than income inequality because wealth is a measure of the value of all the things that households own. And low-income households end up spending most of their income on basic necessities that are consumed, while high-income individuals find it much easier to place some of their wealth in the form of stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and other financial instruments that tend to result in non-trivial share of total wealth. So the distribution of wealth is highly unequally distributed in the U.S. Now, the trends that we just described for the U.S. have also been observed in pretty much all Western economies, and there's been a lot of work that economists have been trying to do to explain why we've been seeing this pattern of increasing income inequality. It's a topic that's likely to be the source of a great deal of research and discussion, both in terms of why it's happening and also potential remedies in the future.